Hey guys, good to see you again. I don't know how many of you remember, but last month I made a typical poll asking which videos you want to see first, and one of the choices was for me to cover Aatrox's rework. I also specified that even if the video was selected as the most popular vote, I would need some time to think about it, and apparently that was a month ago. There were countless videos made on Aatrox, and most of them bore the same attitude that this was a crime against humanity or something along the lines of that. I do agree with the community's general opinion on it because he was actually the reason I got into League of Legends in the first place. There was this one player in a game called MapleStory whose username was Aatrox, and then I discovered that Aatrox was a League champion and a really cool looking one at that. But enough storytelling. Today, we're going to be breaking down Aatrox's old version and comparing it to his new one, deciding which one is better and what my overall thoughts are on his patch history. So welcome everybody to Aatrox's Rework, a retrospective. Based on Riot's track record, almost every rework they've done in the past has been successful in bringing the specimen to the forefront of attention. Granted, there are a few that haven't quite been able to see mainstream success, but that's largely because not everyone can have a 10% pick rate. A couple of them had a somewhat negative reception though. Irelia and Akali were two that people were unhappy about. In their case, it wasn't because their gameplay wasn't improved, far from it. I would say those two were one of Riot's most successful iterations because they still feel like the old versions but with far more quality of life adjustments and actual skill expression versus the linear point and click they had before. But people dislike them because they're too overpowered and annoying to deal with, myself included. The third champion to have a negative response was Aatrox. I guess you could argue that Riot's blunder on him was that of character assassination. If you want some more historical documentation, I suggest you watch Exil's video on Aatrox before you continue on with this one, in case you don't know the full context. Aatrox's old iteration was pretty interesting to say the least. Before Riot used to gradually rework old champions to give them more in-depth gameplay, he was among a large archetype that used to be more prevalent back then, the duelist. Technically that would be currently known as the skirmisher subclass, but with new additions to the category like Kayn, Lilia, Viego, and Sylas, it's not quite the same as it used to be, as those champions do vastly more than just thrust their swords into people. Don't misinterpret that. The duelist archetype consisted of the following champions: Fiora, Irelia, Jax, Master Yi, Shyvana, Trundle, Tryndamere, Udyr, Xin Zhao, and of course, Aatrox. These 10 champions varied in their properties, but shared the playstyle of inflicting the majority of their damage through auto attacks, and all of them had one or more ways to give them a greater advantage as they attack you. It would either be through auto attack resets like Shyvana's Twin Bite or Trundle's Chop, it could be bonus attack speed like Fiora's Burst of Speed or Xin Zhao's Battle Cry, and generally everyone had something that made it easy for them to stick to targets, which would take the form of either a dash or bonus movement speed. However it was executed, they were good at 1v1s and sucked at pretty much everything else. Basically, you could say they were the OG Feast or Famine champions, and they spent much of the early game farming like the world didn't exist around them. Aatrox's primary gimmick was health, so if you remember my healing video, Zac was a super healy tank, Vladimir was a super healy mage, Mundo was a super healy juggernaut, Aatrox was the super healy duelist. His Q, W, and E would drain his HP and fuel his passive with Bloodwell. Depending on how far it was filled up, he got bonus attack speed. Naturally, all health cost champions had some way to regenerate that health. For Aatrox, every third auto attack he had the option to either deal huge amounts of bonus damage at the cost of his HP or heal himself. The rest of his kit was aimed at giving him both a means to engage and play the neutral game, although since Dark Flight was prone to being interrupted by crowd control, he was a little clunky to get the hang of. There would be points in time where his health costs would actually work against him because he would lose like a quarter of his health using all of his abilities at once, and then he would just get bursted down by a Riven or Renekton. Wasn't exactly safe as Vladimir when it came to using his own health as a resource. However, it was fun. And I'm not just saying that because I one-tricked him during State of Devour meta, I genuinely believed he was a more interesting version of Jax, Tryndamere, and Master Yi. Those three champions would turn their brain off and just go in because they had some stupid BS like Counter-Strike, Alpha Strike, or being literally unkillable. Aatrox didn't have any cheesy way to shut people down, but he had a projectile, which means he had an actual neutral game. He could make his opponents approach or use it to farm from a safe distance. To play Aatrox well, you had to really understand what you could or couldn't handle. It's just more often than not you couldn't handle much, which is why no one played him, because he was so predictable and had an underwhelming kit. At the end of the day, the only people who played Aatrox were those who really wanted to play him and not because he was a top tier pick. Fast forward to Season 11 when he got a major overhaul and some much needed enhancements to his gameplay. Because it was pretty obvious that his health costs were more of a hindrance than an interactive experience, They went and removed all of it except a tiny amount from Blades of Torment. But the big change was that they gave his passive a huge boost of attack damage and attack speed for a short duration after reaching maximum Bloodwell, rather than just a persistent boost to his attack speed. Aatrox's main problem was that he wouldn't be able to stick to targets long enough to get more than, I would say, 2 shots of blood price, even with max Bloodwell. So what they did instead was lessen his sustained DPS in exchange for really solid front-loaded damage, in order for him to be able to actually trade in lane by racking up blood stacks and then diving in for some quick burst. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally had a strong playstyle that felt good to play and yielded reasonable results. Before we continue on, I want to break down what I believe the goal was behind his old design and his rework. So like if I was looking at this retroactively, what do I think was the thought process behind his rework? Even though they managed to fix a lot of his issues, especially in the laning phase, Aatrox struggled with 3 problems. 1. His itemization was stretched way too thin. He is, for all intents and purposes, a melee AD carry, just like Tryndamere. This meant he had to focus on building attack damage, attack speed, and whatever on-hit effects he could get his hands on. Now, the reason skirmishers and divers are able to keep up both their offense and defense is because they have properties in their kit that either directly provide them with durability or something to bolster it. Jax had Counter-Strike to completely nullify basic attacks and reduce AoE damage, and his ultimate gave him bonus armor and magic resist based on his damage. Tryndamere was able to go full damage on account of his ultimate being able to shrug off anything for the next 5 seconds. Aatrox had no built-in counter or durability, meaning he was as squishy as an AD carry. Oh, he had his passive revive, but for a while he would respawn with 0 Bloodwell, making him super easy to kill a second time after. If he wanted to build tanky, his damage would suffer a lot, and if he wanted to be damagey, he was the easiest duelist to one-shot, catch 22. Second, Aatrox had to play more like a diver despite having the kit of a skirmisher, and he wasn't particularly good at either due to his over-dependence on max Bloodwell. In other words, inconsistency. Unless he had proper time to set up beforehand, Aatrox would usually have to enter a fight without any Bloodwell stored up since it decays out of combat. His front-loaded damage would be the one that matters more because if he fails to dish out enough damage at the start of a team fight, everyone would start to scatter and make it difficult for him to keep up, even with his increased attack range from his ultimate. Lastly, if you remember the duelist champions I brought up before, there's a sort of problem with all of them. They're pretty much stat sticks. See, most people's impression of a stat stick is Dr. Mundo or Garen, champions who are usually bulky and plodding. But technically speaking, chainsaws like Tryndamere count as stat sticks too. If he wasn't, Malphite wouldn't be the worst matchup in existence for him. Aatrox was also a very polarizing champion. A good number of matchups in top lane he would just insta-lose, and then there would be a good number of matchups he kinda cheeses. Mostly because, manaless champion with infinite sustain who has a long-range projectile that can be used to harass you while farming from a distance. Honestly, I really miss Blades of Torment. I'd rather have that than the current Infernal Chains, but you get the point. Really unhealthy matchup spread, and yes, everyone knows blind picking top lane is synonymous with you don't get to play League of Legends, but Aatrox is arguably one of the most counter-pickable champions in the game. In theory, he could have been a pretty decent jungler, but he just had really terrible clear speed. What the new Aatrox sought to accomplish was give him a more refined playstyle. People like to make the joke that Aatrox's Q is the same as Riven's. That isn't the right mindset. Fundamentally, they share 2 very different objectives in a fight. Riven's whole theme is about rushdown, hitting you hard and fast. You could think of her almost like Roy in Smash Bros. Yes, I'm bringing up Smash again because I've been playing a lot of it. Aatrox on the other hand plays a more bait and punish style. His Q is much slower in cast time than Riven's, though it hits way harder. While he technically can move with Umbral Dash, he can only reliably land multiple sweet spots of his Q when the enemy is most vulnerable, such as right after they burned all their cooldowns. I like to compare him to Marth. Both Roy and Marth are sword users, but they play intrinsically different from each other. One is about aggressively overwhelming his opponents by forcing his own openings, the other is about spacing and bait and punish, waiting for his opponents to misposition or mistime their attacks to then go for the opening. Unless she's up against a really hard matchup like Renekton, Riven's kit doesn't exactly need to wait for an opening. She can land all of her abilities and attacks without fail most of the time. Aatrox on the other hand usually fishes for just the first and maybe second Q, since those can hit targets from range. He doesn't usually use the final hit unless he uses Infernal Chains or his opponent is intent on fighting him all in. Now, that's not counting lane fundamentals. Riven can play for bait and punish and Aatrox can play aggressively, but given their variance in speed and range, they do play very, very differently. At the moment, Aatrox plays very much like a standard juggernaut, someone who can dish out huge amounts of damage albeit at a slow pace. If you were to focus him down, it would take a lot of effort since he heals so much and usually has a lot of health, which means you'd exhaust a lot of resources to finish him while his teammates are fighting at full power. Conversely, if you were to ignore him, he would eventually be able to steamroll all over you because considering in the late game Aatrox has usually about 400 to 500 attack damage after his ultimate, he could dish out well over 2000 damage per full Q rotation. And if you remember before, old Aatrox's problem was that he wasn't really that much of a threat since he was so easy to kite. He's still kiteable now, but at least he's got that raid boss factor to him. I suppose the counter question to that reasoning would be, could they have done that without completely erasing his old identity? The answer, no. The only champions capable of inflicting massive amounts of AoE damage through auto attacks alone are 80 carries with Runon's Hurricane, and there's legitimately nothing else. To elaborate, Aatrox's primary DPS was by slashing you over and over again, and naturally auto attacks can only hit one person at a time. The only way to inflict massive AoE damage is with abilities, and for Aatrox, there was nothing they could have done to retain his current state while accomplishing this goal. Jax, Fiora, Tryndamere and such may be some of the most deadly champions to 1v1, but put them in a team fight and you can play monkey in the middle with them. I suppose they could have added a Tiamat passive to Aatrox, but that wouldn't really apply very well in practice due to his other problems. At least in this way, he can have a really explosive frontal engage. If we look at how he is now, he has a solid matchup spread and enough skill expression to where in losing matchups, there's always a chance he can win, and in winning matchups, there's always a chance he could lose. So the question then turns to whether or not we could have kept the old Aatrox while maintaining the new one. The answer is most undoubtedly yes. They could have very well kept Aatrox as is and make a new character with a different lore, although I think that would have conflicted with the Darken's continuity. Not that there's all that much to flesh out seeing as it's only him and Rost right now, though I find something a little strange with him. Reworks of that magnitude were performed before. Poppy, Urgot, and Scion, we've seen those champions completely transform from what they were, and we've had no problems with any of them. Okay, those three had kits that were so degenerate and stupid that anything was better than what they currently had. But I don't think it's very fair to put a double standard on something just based on circumstance. They were changed from the foundation to have completely different identities. The current Aatrox's playstyle still does bear some of the same vibe as the old one. He no longer is about auto-attacking, but his Q knockups are still there, albeit distributed across 3 attacks instead of 1. He still had a raid boss type ultimate where he would become super big, and, well, you know, revive passive until they took that away. It's not like they turned Aatrox from a skirmisher into an enchanter support. He's still a top laner, he's still a drain tanker, and he still gets destroyed by Riven, so nothing's changed. But who am I kidding? It is difficult to judge his situation because as far as performance goes, he went from being barely played to pretty much a very consistent 5 to 10% pick rate, which means they did accomplish their goal just like they would in other reworks. I think the reason his was such a punch in the face is because they actually did go ahead and fix him without having to change any of his core abilities, and then they released a full visual rework. Like I said before, I think the justification behind it was Riot trying their best to move as many champions away from the Tryndamere playstyle because it doesn't feel very good to play against them when they're winning, and it doesn't feel very good to play when you're losing. They probably did the mini changes to draw more attention to Aatrox, so when the rework happened people wouldn't scratch their heads and be like, who is that? Because let's be real, he was one of the most forgettable champions in existence. I'm talking Yorick levels of irrelevant. Anyways, let me know what you think in the comments down below. I really do miss the old Aatrox. I used to play him a lot. He was my first main actually in Season 5, so has a special place in my heart, but I also really love Aatrox as he is now, and I don't really see a problem with him staying the way he is. But if you enjoyed the video, it would be awesome if you could leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this. Don't forget to follow me on my socials and join my Discord server, and lastly, if you still haven't watched my other discussion videos, I suggest you go check those out. But that's it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for the next one. Take care.